My name is Rami Shami. I'm a case manager with Kensington Health. I'm very honored and privileged to be also supporting caregiver wellness, caregiver support group, Caregiver Connects at Wellspring for individuals supporting loved ones who are traveling the journey of a cancer diagnosis. I also work in hospice palliative care, folks. I work across the province, into the US, into the Caribbean. I teach about end of life and bedside companioning, and I've been doing this for a very long time. Here specifically, we have a caregiver group, a caregiver support group. Some of you actually might be online today that come to that group, where we meet once a week for 3 hours, and we're caregivers. What's called a peer support model can share experiences, teach one another, share resources, support one another as best as they know how. I find that is sometimes the best way caregivers are supported is by like caregivers. You know, myself, just to give you a little bit of a view into my world, I'm a caregiver. I'm a professional or formal caregiver, but I'm also informal in the sense that I care for two parents, my mother and father, who are both in late stages of life, and one of them is actually living with a palliative diagnosis. So in many ways, folks, I relate, especially in these turbulent times. So I don't know if you recognize this part of the world. It is Southern Ontario, and Southern Ontario is an exceptionally diverse demographic or geography. And you can see a little bit of snow there to remind us that snow is not far away, and hopefully our unprecedented times would have cleared up by the time that snow comes up. I just threw that out there, folks. It's just, you know, and working all over the province, the plight of caregivers, even overseas, the plight of caregivers is very similar, almost regardless of geography, sometimes even social economic background, culture, religion, gender, sexual orientation. It's almost the bridge between our struggles is the plight of caregivers, their challenges, and especially, if I could bring light to, their psychosocial emotional experiences of being a caregiver are very, very, very similar. And that's why a lot of our groups, wherever they're facilitated, have this diversity. And then in that diversity, remarkably, they connect because of the journey of being a caregiver. I put this in there, folks. So this is myself, and I don't know if any of you recognize this incredible woman. She is one of the legendary legacied caregivers that I learned a lot from, and that's June Caldwell. She has died. You know, she died sometime around 1994, I believe, and she taught me a lot about caregiving. I know I haven't changed much since that photo, but I've been in caregiving, in hospice palliative care, in supporting people in life-limiting illnesses, and grief and bereavement, which is also a part of caregiving. I wish we could, you know, we spoke about that a few weeks ago at Wellspring in one of the sessions. And I've been in grief and bereavement for almost 30 years. And I've seen a lot happen with respect to caregivers, especially in the last 5 to 7 to 10 years. And if I could just play with that a little bit, is that caregiving at home for somebody living, especially in the demographic that we'll be talking about today, which is cancer, has been almost offloaded to family members. It's almost an expectation now, until you are at your capacity where you can no longer support somebody, or financially you can't do it, or you yourself are struggling with a chronic illness or advanced age, that it's, you know, the role of the caregiver to care for somebody at home. And how much does that impact your life? How much does it impact your psychosocial emotional health? How much does it impact you financially, economically, logistically in the space? We're actually seeing a lot of that impact right now with COVID. You know, when you have a crisis such as a pandemic, it really starts to not only highlight but grow the cracks within the system. And right now, the cracks are enormous for caregivers in how they're receiving and being able to provide support. So maybe we should just define. I mean, I got really hot and heavy there, and I got right into the whole aspect of being a caregiver. I get very excited about this work, folks. I'm very passionate about it. But let us just define what it is to be a caregiver. I mean, think to yourselves, what is a caregiver? There is a common denominator to what it is to be a caregiver. It's someone who provides care. And in this case, It's somebody who provides care for a loved one who is living with cancer. You might have heard me before when I classified caregivers as formal as informal, and I should have been more sensitive to the fact that these might not be common terms. So formal caregivers, most likely somebody who does it, who cares for someone else and is a professional or gets paid for it, right? And informal caregivers is probably everybody else on the line today, including myself, as I bridge those two worlds, is somebody who does it for a loved one or a friend. And that is the vast majority of caregivers, folks. Caregivers are literally the backbone of the healthcare industry. If we didn't have families support our loved ones when they are ill, when they have cancer, there would not be. We've seen it right now with COVID. We would not have the capacity to to care for everyone. So there's an enormous load on families and friends to be, providing the care. And just to add a little piece to that, just a couple of weeks ago, we had International Women's Day. And true or false, I mean, maybe you won't be able to answer this, but true or false, the majority of informal caregivers, as in friends and family, are female. And you can imagine how much load there is on um, the capacity of women to care for their loved ones. And I won't get into how that is, why that is, the generations, the stereotypes, the inequity. That's a whole nother webinar we might come up with, but there's an ethical piece to that too. But the vast majority are women, are female. And if we could start a little bit high level, and maybe we could get into some of the emotions of caregiving. There's a lot of aspects and domains to caregiving, but the one we're going to talk about today, which is the title of the presentation, is guilt. And so maybe we could just start with some of the emotions for caregiving. And I believe some of you would actually resonate and recognize some of these emotions. Let's take a look. We have anger in caregiving. And as I go through this, if you wouldn't mind, possibly, just think to yourselves in the intimacy of your space, since we're all in, social distancing and isolation, what have you. Which of these really resonate with you? Which of these carry a great deal of meaning for you, and why? When I'll get into a little bit later some of the strategies and what have you to navigate these emotions, but I think it really begins with, folks, it really begins with acknowledging that we feel these, in the privacy of our own domain, in the privacy of our minds and hearts. When we come to caregiver groups, such as the one here called Caregiver Club at Kensington Health, or at Wellspring, yeah, sorry, I heard a ding. These emotions, this is what we do. We share those emotions. And just as emotions, not necessarily have to characterize them as what or why and put conditions on them and judgments on them, but just the fact that they're emotions. And let's begin, anger. I've seen a great deal of anger expressed in caregiving. It's one way we express actually the grief in caregiving is through anger. There's fear. And if you ask yourself, what are you afraid of, or what would people be afraid of, or caregivers be afraid of while caregiving? Well, there's a multitude of fears. One, how am I going to do this on my own? What's going to happen to me after my loved one dies? Who's going to care for me? How are my family, if I'm not alone, how are my family impacted? How is this going to affect us financially? What is my life going to be now? My activities, my social life, my work, my relationships, my friendships. For in many cases, there's a fear of the optics of it. If anybody knows that we can't, as a family, support one another, then there's a fear of judgment or shame, right? And sometimes shame is a very slippery slope to guilt. They're connected quite intricately. Anxiety. There's a great deal that can actually become apparent with caregiving in terms of being anxious at the situation, being anxious at the outcome of the situation, and sometimes anxiety, you might have recognized, can be incapacitating. Now imagine you're caregiving You are what is called fight or flight, like adrenaline, stress, tension, which can, bring us into a state of what's called hyperarousal. And it can precipitate as anxiety. That causes some incapacitation, meaning you can't do as much or what you used to be able to do. And then all of a sudden, you can't care for your loved one. And then you see how the guilt can start to, creep in there. And it's a natural flow because of the tax and load of being a caregiver. Helplessness. You look at look at COVID right now. How many people are experiencing helplessness when there might be a shortage of PSWs going into the home, or nursing staff, or not being able to go out and buy groceries or take care of, basic duties and tasks that will help the person we're caring for. There's a sense of helplessness. And again, I throw these out there and just watch how it links into guilt. These are by no means exhaustive, these emotions. This sense of helplessness, that I can't do more, that I can't help more, that a sense of helplessness that I can't stop this from happening, the progression of the disease. And then that slowly creeps into the possibility of feeling guilty. Or hopelessness. A lot of us may be feeling now a sense of a loss of hope in terms of what's going to happen to our society, to our way of living. But the hopelessness could be also in that if all my energy and resources are put into caring for a loved one, what's left for me? And that hopelessness comes from the fact that what will happen to me? I'll burn out, I'll become exhausted, I'll become sick. I'll be perfectly honest with you folks and straight up, as expected. Many a times in caregiving, when somebody's almost a full-time caregiver, when they enter a facility such as a long-term care center like ours, at Kensington Health, or a hospice, sometimes and oftentimes they follow suit with illness. And that's a sense of hopelessness people fear. And then in the hopelessness, there's a feeling of guilt in that, one, they can't do as much anymore, or two, they didn't take care of themselves enough that now they are sick. Guilt just weaves into all of this. It's sticky, and it infiltrates into almost, and I hope I say this sensitively, almost like a virus. It infiltrates all emotions. How about frustration? There could be a sense of frustration involved with caregiving, let alone the tax and the tension and the duties and sometimes even the lack of knowledge. How do I change it depends? How do I care for my loved one as one caregiver, she said it so eloquently, I'm free help. There's hired help and I'm the free help. And her frustration was that she didn't have enough help. And do you know where the guilt set in? The guilt set in the fact that she was frustrated. She felt frustrated. She says, look at my husband. He's not well. He's struggling with this illness, and I'm frustrated. He can't move, and I'm frustrated. And then the guilt set in. Right? Exhaustion. Absolutely exhausted in the caregiving role. It's usually a full-time job, and then you have a full-time role as a husband, wife, father, mother, grandparent, son, daughter, or a full-time job. And then when we get tired, we're not able to provide the care that we usually provide. And again, guilt can set in. It's that I'm not able to do that I was able to do a year ago. In modern medicine, we've done very well in being able to help people live longer, especially with chronic or terminal illnesses or life-limiting illnesses. But as people live longer, there's also an unfortunate, not to say it's good or bad, but there's a side effect to that, in that caregivers have to or are required to or want to caregive for a longer period of time. And that can result in absolute physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, existential exhaustion. And then when they're tired and they can't go any further, that's when the feeling of guilt sets in. There can be sadness and grief wrapped together. I've heard from caregivers saying, how can I be sad when she is suffering so much? I can go out on a bike, I can socially distance, I can be with my friends, but I'm sad for the life that we used to have. I used to go on trips to Paris, and I used to play golf, and now I can't, because of the situation of their illness. And it makes me sad, but I don't feel the right to be sad because of what she's going through. And in honor and not honoring that emotion, guilt sets in. Let's look at a few more. Very, very common is grief in caregiving. There's so much lost daily as somebody travels the journey of cancer. And in the grief, anger is a very strong proponent of it, or an expression of it. And guilt is almost its family to grief. And I'll get into a little bit more of what are some of the experiences of guilt when it comes to grief. But it's I am losing this. However, I'm not the one that's sick. So why should I feel grief, anger, or sadness at losing that when I'm not the one sick? Then guilt sets in. There's a sense of even resentment. And in the privacy of your settings, and your homes, you wonder sometimes, and you can ask yourself and even think to yourself, because in full honesty, I think to myself about this sometimes, is I've lost so much, our lives have changed, and I'm not completely okay with it. There's a slight bit of resentment, a slight bit of resentment to how my life turned out, and what I have to do now that I didn't have to do a few years ago, or what I thought my life would be. This is what I thought my life would be. And I'm slightly resentful, maybe not necessarily at the person I'm caring for, or have to care for, or want to care for, but I'm slightly resentful of the fact that my life isn't that anymore. And then the feeling of guilt sets in, saying, how can I be resentful about something such as that when my family member is up against so much? There can be times of joy, of course, as we recognize the small things, or the things that bring us happiness and contentment. And there oftentimes can be a sense of guilt when that joy is not correlated with the person we're caring for. So if we go to the movies pre-COVID, post-COVID, or we enjoy something that fuels our hearts and minds and souls, and for that instant, we think to ourselves, how can I be in joy? How can I be in happiness? How can I even enjoy this when my loved one that I'm caring for is not well and not in joy? And again, the guilt sets in. There's a lot of talk of forgive yourself and be in gratitude, but we have to be mindful that what is the underlying feeling when we say, I have gratitude for what I have, right? Because and when I say mindful, it's to be recognizing that it can be very important to be thankful and in gratitude for that which you still have, time, space, pleasure with the loved one, with your loved one. But I've heard from caregivers that sometimes when they think that way, just lurking as a black cloud in the wings is a feeling of guilt that they should not be feeling that way. And we'll talk about a little bit how to navigate that in the future slides. There can be a sense of ambivalence, right? And ambivalence, distance, separation. And oftentimes that separation isn't a lack of love. It's actually self-protective, where the caregiver has reached a point where they emotionally, mentally, physically almost can't go anymore, right? Even just it doesn't have to be forever or for weeks, just for that moment. And feelings of guilt can set in there, where it appears that the person doesn't care anymore, but in fact, they're just exhausted. They need a distance, they need a break. Not uncommon, folks, is depression. Depression can set in at any time during caregiving. And depression can be a result of all the other emotions, a sense of hopelessness, helplessness. And when somebody is, in a stage of not necessarily clinical depression, which can be supported medically, but just down. What happens is this feeling sometimes inside. I've heard from caregivers. Most of what I'm telling you, folks, is just I'm relaying back from caregivers that I've worked with for 30 years, right? It's we learn from one another, and we share with one another, and that's how we hopefully be able to support one another. Is that if a caregiver becomes depressed or down, they worry that it's affecting the mood of the person they're caring for. So the person they're caring for looks at them and sees them as depressed. Then the person who's providing the care, the caregiver, sees the reaction that they are causing, excuse me, to the loved one, and then feels guilty that their depression or sadness or downness is causing that to the person they love that they're caring for. Guilt sets in. In many communities, as I showed you the picture of Southern Ontario, we live in a very diverse demographic, probably the most diverse in the world, folks. And sometimes being a caregiver is felt, and especially if there's need outside help, is this feeling of embarrassment that something has happened to my family that I have to caregive for somebody in my family, and the sense of shame and embarrassment that this has happened to us, that there's an illness within us, that we might not be able to care enough for us, for the loved one. The capacity is too much. We need outside help. And then embarrassment sets in. And in the embarrassment can sometimes be a sense of guilt. If you want to spin it a different way, I'm all about spinning things today. Forgive me for that. Is the fact of the physical pathology. Sometimes, as some of us might know, is that cancer can cause disfigurations, pathologies, tumors that are exposing, and what have you, is that the embarrassment is by the caregiver in bearing witness to it, and sometimes either not finding their loved one attractive anymore, a decrease in sexual energy, or not even being able to look at the pathology anymore. And that sense of embarrassment can lead to guilt. I've often heard from caregivers a sense of loneliness. Now you imagine, right? You have your loved one at home, or even in a facility such as long-term care, or in a hospital, as could be the case. You're there, you're with your loved one, and yet you feel alone. And oftentimes caregivers feel guilt in that they're not alone. The loved one is there, but the relationship has changed. The family has changed. The household has changed. They're not in the same space anymore, especially if it's advanced cancer and the person is progressing towards, end of life. Then they can often be in different spaces, mentally, emotionally, and in that regard, they don't relate as much to one another, and then a sense of loneliness. And that sense of loneliness could be the fact that there isn't that connection anymore. Then the caregiver starts to feel like, I'm no longer a wife or a husband anymore, a mother or father, a son or a daughter. I'm a caregiver, right? But I'm alone in this because our connection is lost. And when we start to recognize those feelings of loneliness and recognize that the other person's no longer necessarily connected to us, guilt sets in. See how it interweaves and moves through all different sorts of emotions. It's almost, in my mind, unmistakable and, how can I say, always present, this feeling of guilt. I've rarely come across a caregiver who doesn't have some experience of guilt. Now, we've talked a lot about the emotions involved and how guilt interplays, but maybe we back up just a little bit, and maybe I should have started with this, but I didn't want to. I assumed everybody would have an idea of what guilt is, but can we define it? Can we just take a quick look at it? What is guilt? What is it? And in my mind, it's a couple of things. And one of those things is that it's a perception, okay? And it could also be an emotion. And for clarity, it can be defined as a feeling we experience when we feel we have done something quote unquote wrong. Now, if we tailor that to caregiving, it's this, all I've heard from caregivers, folks, is that it's something that I could have done more, right? Something that I should have known better about, something I should have advocated more for, something that I would have done differently. After the fact, in retrospect, everybody's heard hindsight is 20/20. And so all these create the experience of this feeling that I didn't do enough, didn't do it right, I did something wrong, and I deserve self-reproach and self-critique. And let's begin with perception. Since spring is coming, I'll put some sunglasses out there. A lot of guilt begins with a perception of the situation, a self-perception and a perception of the person we're caring for. It's how we see it. And if I can just modify that a little bit, that it's not just a perception, but oftentimes, folks, it's a misperception. I can't tell you how often I've sat with caregivers and heard, Rami, I'm doing this, and 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 my health is failing, and I'm tired, and I'm exhausted, and I'm broke, but I don't feel like I'm doing enough. And in that, anyway, as an outside observer, that's a beauty of peer support, caregiver support groups. In that, the misperception is in how do we see ourselves and how do we see what we're doing in the context of the situation. And that takes a little bit of self-awareness and sometimes reflective practice. Reflective practice by, and who's best to do that with, is other caregivers who reflect back and say, well, look at what all that you are doing. And we can be very self-critical and self-reproaching and almost self-punishing in terms of seeing all that we're not doing in comparison to all that we are doing. Maybe we'll look at now at what do we perceive as the wrongs. You know, I put that in quotations because it's not often that we see right and wrong in caregiving, but the wrongs, especially in informal caregiving. Let's look at some of what we perceive, or maybe I should say we misperceive as the wrongs. Not having done enough to prevent the illness in the first place. I didn't ask her or him to eat better. I didn't eat better. I didn't set a good example. I smoked in the house. I let them smoke in the house. All these aspects in hindsight is that what could I have done differently? Very common, very common. What could I have done differently to have avoided or stopped what happened now? Feeling should be able to do more. So caregivers, I find, always feel like they haven't done enough for the most part. I feel like I should have done more. I could have helped more. I could have supported more. And it happens, folks, almost at any length of the caregiving journey. It could be at the beginning. It could be in the middle. It could be towards the end. Just this feeling that if only I did this. And when I talk to caregivers, it's almost a list of hundreds of things that they could have done. And when sometimes we do this exercise, and I welcome you to try it, is make a list of all the things you are doing as a caregiver and the things you feel you're not doing as a caregiver. And when I do this exercise with caregivers in support groups, the list that they are doing is huge. And the list that they're not doing is usually small. But somehow we give more importance to that than we do to that which we are doing. Sometimes caregivers in the intimacy of a setting is that there's this feeling that they want this all just to end. They don't want this to happen anymore. The guilt sets in right there. Is that, you know, folks, if it was any other experience, if you just take yourself out of the caregiving role and you put yourself in a situation where you're just experiencing the stress, the trauma, caregiving can be very traumatizing. Watching somebody suffer that you love with a life-limiting illness can be very traumatizing. It can stay in our minds for a very long time. It changes the way we think about the world, about ourselves. It's just the feeling, let's go back just to the feeling of being taxed, exhausted, worn out, feeling helpless, all these emotions. Just take that. Who wouldn't want that to end? And yet caregivers feel oftentimes guilty because they want their situation to end. And sometimes in the intimacy and the sensitivity of a group or on one-on-one, sometimes folks, and you'll see later in the slides, they'll actually say, I just wish they'd hurry up and die. I would never say this to them, but I just can't do this anymore. I can't watch them suffer. I can't help them as much anymore. I can't deal with everything that's happening. But I feel so guilty that I want this just over and done with. It's a very normal feeling, folks. And yet the feeling that I'm thinking something wrong or I'm feeling guilty about what I said pervades it. We actually see this a lot with formal caregivers, but also informal caregivers like family and friends is that we become sometimes impatient or frustrated with the person, not just with the person we're providing care for, but with the provision of care itself. Sometimes we're not, as we were almost gained capacity, or we had to start caregiving for our loved ones more at home, right? Because there isn't as much capacity in the hospitals and long-term care. I mean, it's usually 2 to 4 years, 5 years wait for long-term care. We have to learn things. We have to learn how to do things at home. And that can be very frustrating, especially if it's something that you've never done before. You have to learn anew. You have to practice. It can be I mean, look at us now. We're just trying to figure out Zoom, and that can be just taxing, let alone all the intricacies of caregiving. And then when a caregiver feels impatient or frustrated, oftentimes there's nowhere for that to go. There's nowhere for that to be expressed. And sometimes it can turn into the relationship between themselves and the loved one they're caring for, or it's self-imposed. They feel guilty, right, about feeling impatient and feeling frustrated. See, it's amazing how guilt can be the superimposition, the feeling that climbs up on top of other feelings. We feel impatient, we feel frustrated at the stress of care, and then all of a sudden we feel guilty because we feel that. And then they interweave and become interlaced, right? Whereas they're very natural feelings. And what happens? Oftentimes, folks, I hear from caregivers is that they feel that they're no longer loving or liking the loved one at times. They have a challenge hearing them or being connected with them. They've changed. And as a result of the illness, the caregiver themselves have had to change their role, change the dynamic of their relationship, sometimes even feel like they lost being a son or daughter, husband, wife, or partner, right? And then all of a sudden, that flavor of love or the style of liking is lost, and guilt sets in on that. But however, those are very normal feelings. They're actually feelings of grief, meaning recognizing how you feel at the loss of what was the love, how it's changed, and what you used to like about the person and what you don't like anymore about the situation. And what happens, and it's very common with caregivers, what happens if the loved one falls, their condition worsens? And as a caregiver, sometimes we feel like we're not doing enough to stop it. I didn't get the chair in time. I didn't order the automated wheelchair in time. I didn't advocate with the company to get the chair in time so that she wouldn't fall or he wouldn't fall, or I would have prevented it. Right? It's almost as if caregivers have this, oftentimes, not in every case, this sense of perfectionism or this ideal. They have this, put themselves an ideal that they have to do everything right. And sometimes that feeling doesn't come out until things go wrong. And they always go wrong. In caregiving, it's never a perfect science. Something's going to go wrong. Something's going to be missed. An appointment's going to be missed. The condition might worsen. And something happens. A fall happens. And then all of a sudden the caregiver feels a tremendous amount of guilt that they let that little thing go wrong. Right? So rare that caregivers think of their needs. And what I hear from caregivers is that, I feel selfish, Ron. I feel, even if I think about myself and taking care of myself in any way, I need a break. I absolutely need a break. I'm exhausted. I'm having bad dreams. I'm breaking out in hives. I have eczema. I'm starting to develop chronic fatigue. I'm depressed. But I have to keep going. But I have to take a break at the same time. But I can't think about my needs because I feel selfish. Well, look at my wife or my husband. Look what they're going through. How can I want to take a walk or a break or talk on the phone or enjoy a drink? It makes me feel selfish. And therein lies the guilt. Very, very common in caregiving, folks. Very common is the feelings of inadequacy. Feeling like I am inadequate in doing this. I should be able to do this, or I should know how to do this, or I should be able to be taught how to do this. Excuse me. And then not being able to do and be everything for their loved one. I don't know where in our lifetimes we came across this idea or this notion that we have to be the be all and take care of all for our loved ones as a caregiver. Maybe it's the expectation of the healthcare system. Maybe it's just the need that has to be that we have to take care of everything. Very common for caregivers to feel inadequate because so much is put on them. And the sense of adequacy is almost irrespective of what they're doing. They could be doing everything right. They could be providing excellent care. They miss one thing and they feel this sense of inadequacy that they didn't take care of it all. They didn't do everything right. And thus lies the guilt and feeds into this sense of inadequacy. Here's a little bit more. There's this feeling of a loss of independence, and they assume a new role. Meaning, as a caregiver, I've heard it from many caregivers, is that I'm no longer his wife. I am his caregiver. I am no longer her partner. I am her care provider, right? And in assuming this new role, they feel a loss of who and what they are. But once they feel this loss of who and what they are, all of a sudden there's sense of guilt saying, well, you can't have time for that. You can't worry about, your self-perception and your loss of independence. You have somebody to care for. They're dependent on you. There's the guilt. Sometimes in caregiving, because the load is so much, or builds up to so much, and folks, it's all a matter of perspective. I've heard from many caregivers, well, my load for caregiving isn't as much as hers or his. It's all perspective. It's all what it is for you. Just because your loved one is not necessarily at end of life or in a condition where it robs them of completely their physicality, doesn't mean the caregiving isn't taxing. Even the anticipation, and this is part of traumatization, even the anticipation of what the future holds a year or 2 years down the road can be enough to be stressful and anxiety provoking, as if the situation is happening right now. That's caregiving. The mind recognizes, how much is taxed in this, and in that, there can be a sense of loss of control. So what happens when we feel or perceive, whether it's actually happening or not, this sense of loss of control? Sometimes we clamp down and we become really focused on that which is uncontrollable. For example, somebody progressing in their disease state, somebody progressing with cancer. We can't stop it. We can't slow it down. We can't control it. So we end up doing is finding the areas where we feel we can control or stop. But when we do that, then sometimes we recognize that we're becoming over controlling in one area as a compensation for that which we feel we can't control. In that recognition, we feel guilty because we feel like sometimes, well, I'm making sure that he's eating this and taking care of this, or she's doing this, because I can't stop the fact that they're dying. Also, the opposite could happen. We can feel that there's a complete loss of control of what's happening, and we withdraw. The withdrawal from a loved one in the caregiving role is actually self-protective. We're actually trying, most times, folks, we do this unconsciously. We don't recognize we're doing it until we sit and we talk about it. We don't recognize that we're withdrawing. And when we're withdrawing, we're actually just protecting our emotions, our heart, our mind, because the load is so great. Something I keep in my mind all the time, folks, for myself, right, and for people I support and caregive for, and what have you, is I give myself and everyone else the benefit of the doubt that we're doing the best we can with what we have in the moment. And in that way, sometimes that dissipates the feelings of guilt that more should be done by us as informal caregivers. I've heard from caregivers sometimes this desire to escape, to find relief, to find a way out, to get out. And that's actually biological. You come to understand something about trauma and something about fight or flight or freeze. We usually fight, flight, or freeze. That is our prehistoric biological brain. Back in when there's tigers and lions and we were fighting in the jungle to survive, the way we'd survive is that either we'd fight the tiger or lion, the danger, we'd run away as fast as we could, okay? That's when the adrenaline hits in, or we freeze to pretend that, to kind of cloak ourselves so that the danger doesn't see us. Well, we don't have tigers and lions except on Netflix and in the wild jungle somewhere in the world. But the feelings of stress and danger, folks, are very real, except the mind doesn't really conceptualize and know the difference between a danger in terms of, being eaten and a danger in terms of watching a loved one suffer with cancer. The mind doesn't switch the two, doesn't separate the two. So what ends up happening is that we react to situations in the same way in our prehistoric mind, that this is dangerous, this is stressful, this is going to harm me, and unconsciously we want to get out. But then we feel guilty. How can I want to leave my loved one? How can I want to leave the person I've been caring for years, that I care, I'm responsible for, or depend, they're dependent on me. But it's a natural biological way for us to cope with what we perceive as danger. We want a way out. But when we think that way, how we're socialized, we start to feel guilty. And a way around that, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, a way around that is just to recognize that it's actually very natural for us to want to run away from something that incurs stress on us, that causes us stress, that causes us pain, that causes us suffering. And in my mind, what is more, and after 30 years, I'm very thankful for what I've been able to experience. What is more taxing and more causing of suffering than to watch a loved one suffer? Of course, the capacity that is immeasurable. And we could actually speak about the pressure, societal and healthcare systems, the pressure put on caregivers, whether we want to or not. Sometimes we are pressured into providing, becoming a caregiver. Sometimes it's familial or cultural responsibility, the oldest son or daughter, right? Or family members who have come over here, as my family did, as refugees. They sacrificed so much for our lives, and now I'm going to abandon them. There's almost an accountability, a responsibility. And in that, when you challenge that in our minds and hearts, we feel guilty because we've been afforded so much to have the life that we have. How can we turn our backs on the people that were able to provide it for us? And that's a very unique thing in Southern Ontario, folks, because we have such an incredible volume of immigration to Canada that we're seeing a lot with caregivers who are second generation, third generation, feel very guilty about recognizing all that's been sacrificed by their parents and family to give them a life here in Canada, in this wonderful country, especially Southern Ontario, and yet be taxed with caregiving for them now that they're ill, not that they're sick. Caregiving is exhausting, whether it's full-time, part-time. It takes a lot out of us. And you know why it takes a lot out of us? It's because it affects us mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. It takes all of us. I mean, all of you, not all of us, but all of us as well, but all of you as an individual to provide care. You're almost on all the time, right? I recognize that with caregivers that I support and myself. You're on, meaning you're in hyperarousal, meaning your radar is on. If you get that phone call while you're at work, or you're at home and you hear a thud, or you anticipate their needs, or their pain spikes, or they're not feeling well because the cancer is progressing. It's all systems go. It's all hands on deck all the time for caregivers. That's exhausting. That's being on all the time. Imagine if you're an adrenaline or you're fighting tigers all the time, right? It drains you, right? And then caregivers feel guilty because they some way feel that they can't support themselves. They can't find energy for themselves. And if they try to or do so, they feel bad because they look at their loved ones and they look at, their who they're caring for, and they say, well, they're even more tired than I am. And how can I find time? Or, respectively, folks, sometimes they can't find the time to go away. They're at home. Look at COVID, right? Where did we go? Where are we going to go? And even pre-COVID, sometimes caregivers are stuck at home all day because they can't leave their loved ones for a short period of time. And then they feel guilty because they want to leave. They want to get out. They want to do something. Very often, folks, we question our ability to care for our loved ones. And that's the ideal I was talking about. Sometimes when I sit with caregivers, I ask them, what are you living up to? What are your values? Like, are you living up to an ideal of what a caregiver should be? Are you living up to an ideal of what you were taught, learned, grew up with, of what a caregiver should be, of what society is, what nurses, physicians, and PSWs do? And where's your abilities? Where are you expecting your lack of ability, learned or otherwise, in providing care. Because once you recognize and are aware of what you can and cannot do, sometimes that dissipates the guilt of not being able to do it. Because then either we can learn, or we find a way to do it, or find somebody else to do it, rather than being stuck in this feeling that I'm just not good enough because I can't do this. As I mentioned previously, folks, you might have might remember, bearing witness to a loved one in suffering and in pain. Pain and suffering are not necessarily the same thing, folks. Pain usually is more physically attributed, and suffering is usually mental, emotional, spiritual, existential. They can go hand in hand, but they can be very separate. Bearing witness to the suffering and pain of a loved one is very, very taxing. It can be very taxing. And that causes, this is sometimes to the caregiver, suffering themselves, and sometimes even physical pain. And when a caregiver starts to suffer at the results or consequence of caregiving for someone else, oftentimes that loved one who's ill, who's being caregived for, sees that. And the caregiver, in not being able to relieve the pain and suffering of that loved one, feels guilty because their own suffering is starting to impact the person they're caring for. And that is a very complex dance of guilt in those situations. I'll never forget this one gentleman said this to me. This is in full confidence, of course, because you don't know who he is. He says, this is a number of years ago. He says, I have to tell you, I would never admit this to anybody, right? And I feel extremely guilty, but I just can't watch her suffer anymore, and I can't care for her anymore. And I just wish she would die. And to watch the grief and the guilt on his face, because it's not about necessarily not wanting to be with her anymore or not loving her anymore. The guilt was that he just couldn't take the situation anymore. He couldn't bear witness to watching her lose her identity, her personality, her capacity to do things. And then he couldn't as well provide the care anymore. He was exhausted. They shared a wonderful life together, and he said, I can't believe I'm going to say this. And then imagine his experience of guilt. A guilt that he struggled shaking just because he had those feelings. Very normal feelings, because you just want the situation to end. So let's talk, folks, a little bit about how does it affect us? How does guilt affect us? And I like to call this an entering of sorts. When we start to look at the experience of guilt as a caregiver, I find we enter into a portal or a deeper aspect of ourselves. You start to really look inward of who and what you are, what your values are, what your fears are, what your apprehensions are. It's almost as if guilt pulls that all out and serves as the mechanism or the avenue or the catalyst for which all those feelings could be expressed. So I like to call it as a noun as the entering. So we enter almost to a deeper aspect of ourselves when we start to be intimate with the experience of guilt as a caregiver. And I'll tell you, folks, I've seen, this is not by any means an exhaustive list, right? How does guilt affect us? It can actually somaticize. It can go into our bodies. It can actually cause physical pain. And why I can attest to that is because when we start to, in caregiver support, start to look at physical pain and what it actually feels like, sometimes the emotions involved in that pain are feelings of guilt, right? I've seen headaches. I've seen insomnia. People can't sleep because of their feelings of guilt. And I just want to put something out there as well. I did this with a caregiver support group a few weeks ago. We looked at the difference between being guilty and feeling guilty. And I asked the group how many of them felt they were guilty, right? And it's a different context, and yet it's the same thing. Most of them said they weren't guilty, but they felt guilty. That's a very important distinction, right? And we'll get that in a little bit when we get more into emotions. Being guilty and feeling guilty are a little bit different. Okay? Being guilty is that you actually did something that, for characterization of ethical principles, is wrong, right? Feeling guilty is the perception, the thought, the feeling of having done something wrong when you might not have. And that's where most caregivers lie. They're rarely guilty of anything, of actually being guilty of anything. They just feel that way. And when it comes to a feeling, as it somaticizes into the body, when we recognize that it is just a feeling and doesn't necessarily have to affect what we do and how we do it, it can remain as a feeling. And we'll get to a little bit more about that. I've actually seen people experience nausea and digestive issues. It's almost as if the guilt internalizes and goes into their stomachs, their digestive tracts. There's a biological explanation for that too, because fight or flight manifests in the digestive tract, right? That's where our neuroreceptors are all created. Chronic fatigue is very common with guilt. It's such a burdensome emotion that it can make somebody very, very tired. And anxiety attacks. The anxiety is in the lack of resolution in the emotion. It's almost damned if you do, damned if you don't, and you get stuck in there and you lose complete control of the situation because you want a break. You can't take a break because it makes you feel guilty. So you stay in the situation and you're almost torn between the two. Let's look at it mentally, emotionally. Guilt can absolutely erode and be self-destructive in our self-esteem, make us feel even worthless, right? It can make you feel like you're not even worth the care. And oftentimes caregivers say that, say, I'm not worthy of care because I didn't do a good enough job with my loved one. There could be a lot of self-reproach and self-criticism, attacking oneself for that which they did not do. They can lead to experiences of isolation. We've talked about depression. It can even lead to weight gain. When we're in fight or flight, folks, most of the time, we eat because the body thinks it's in starvation mode. And so we gain weight. There could be self-neglect as an experience of guilt. No, I'm not going to take care of myself because I feel guilty because my loved one needs it more. There can be an experience of self-sabotage and harm, where we can engage in substances, we can engage in activities and behaviors. That is part of the traumatization of being a caregiver. But the underlying feeling is that we feel guilty, which infuses us with self-reproach and worthlessness, sense of worthlessness. And right at the end, you'll see there can be even a sense of perfectionism. Because it's my loved one I'm caring for, because I'm caregiving for the most important person in the world to me, I got to get this right. I can't F this up. I have to make sure this is perfect because I only get one shot at this. And so this sense of perfectionism leads to an unrealistic capacity to caregive. Nothing's perfect. In caregiving, most of it is fly by the seat of our pants, trying to figure out, even in the medical field, even in the healthcare settings, we're just trying to work it day by day. And to expect caregivers, often who are not trained or taught or have to figure things out to be perfect, a sense of perfectionism can be very setting the bar to an unrealistic level. We will never reach it. You'll never care for your loved one perfectly. And in fact, folks, most people that I talk to, almost everybody I've talked to as a caregiver, always felt like, I was talking to a colleague today, always felt like they just could have done more. They know they've done a great job. Everybody's telling me I've done a great job, but I could have done more. So I'd love if this was interactive. Love just for you, even if it's not, just think to yourselves, what does guilt feel like for you? What's it feel like? All we're trying to do is create a sense of awareness around the emotion. What's it feel like to you? You know, in your body, in your mind, your heart, what even visually, if you can conceptualize and create a picture of it, what does it look like? Right? And sometimes in caregiver groups, we draw it out, right? Or we write about it. We try, what does guilt feel like? And write about it, right? You can even, if you know what works, folks, is you separate yourself from it and say, here's guilt over here. Okay, here's guilt over here. You can actually, by separating yourself from it, talk about it as if it's not you and almost permission yourself to tell the story of what guilt is to you without you blocking it, right? And that almost permissions the unconscious mind to start to tell you what you truly feel about yourself in the caregiving role. Another question, are there feelings that guilt is trying to push out? So often, folks, I find there's guilt and then there's all these other feelings underlying it. There's all these other emotions, feelings, thoughts, self-perceptions that lie underneath the guilt. And once we start to poke that guilt, it starts to speak to all those other feelings, not necessarily the other way around. Sometimes sense of low self-esteem, sense of worthlessness, sense of inadequacy lie underneath the guilt. And once we start to play with that, those actually come up because they might actually be truly part of who and what we are. And they could be other aspects, fear of death, fear of change, anxiety to have things change, and then the feelings of guilt almost compensate for it. So guilt may not be the be all to end all emotion. What lies underneath often has its own context and its own expression. Also, I ask caregivers is how do you respond to feelings emotionally, mentally, emotionally, and outwardly? But what do you do with it? What do you do with the guilt? How do you navigate it? Right? And in recognizing what how we navigate or how we engage the guilt, what do we do with it, can sometimes give us a hint to what we could do differently. Now, I'll speak to it in a little bit, is that sometimes we can change the emotion or perception of guilt into regret. It's a difference, right? Feeling guilty and feeling regretful are in the same continuum, but one has less self-destructive aspects to it than the other, and one is less sticky than the other. So let's see what we can do about the experience of guilt. And folks, these are by no means exhaustive. Find support groups, caregiver support groups, peer support. Like what I mean by peer support is other caregivers supporting other caregivers with a facilitator like myself or somebody at Wellspring to be one of the best avenues to engage guilt. But here are some other aspects that we can engage guilt. I ask people honestly just to acknowledge the feeling. Acknowledge what you feel guilty about and what it feels like for you. Just think about it, feel it. Sometimes when we feel something, folks, we create almost a buffer around it, almost a separation that we say, oh, that's my feeling over there, but I'm over here. I'm watching myself feel it. And once we do that, we create just a bit of objectivity. When we have that objectivity, we can create a reference point. Meaning, am I really guilty about what I'm doing? Should I feel guilty? It's the question that matters, not about getting rid of the guilt. It's about questioning whether it's really relevant, appropriate, and almost in line with what you're doing. Does it make sense? That's all we need to do. And we do that by acknowledging the feeling and what we feel guilty about. And sometimes it's very difficult to even bring that up. Try to identify other feelings that may lie underneath the guilt. Once we start to poke guilt and play with it and feel it, we start to look underneath it. Is there any other emotions in there? Any other thoughts, self-perceptions, right? Oftentimes guilt is the communicator of what we think about ourselves, right? And situations pull that out from us. We're seeing it with life right now with COVID, right? It's who and what we are underneath this emotion that almost blankets and covers and tells a story or offers to tell the story of what we feel, especially about our values and self-perception. I ask caregivers to give themselves permission. I can't give you permission. You have to look at providing permission to yourselves to have any feeling whatsoever. It can be hate, fear, anxiety, joy, whatever it may be. Just experience it, be with it, and give yourself permission to feel it in respect with respect to caregiving. Once you give permission to feel it, to be with it, then there's an identifier there. And once you identify it, then you can start to work with it. But as long as you don't identify it, like a scent, like a scent, it actually covers you and influences your actions without you knowing. And recognizing that your feelings don't necessarily control your actions is very important in caregiving. Just because we're frustrated, impatient, feeling guilty, feeling bad about not providing enough care, or that our life has changed, or wondering, I heard from a colleague today, or a good friend of mine, they said, I'll never go on a trip again, right? I'll never be able to go to go somewhere again, but I feel really guilty about saying that because I always wanted to go, but I can't because my husband's sick, right? It's just acknowledging the feeling. It doesn't necessarily have to control your actions. And sometimes it allows your actions to be controlled by more objectivity than if you don't recognize what the feeling is. And look for possible causes of guilt. Specifically, are you recognizing or aware that you have a need that's unmet of your own? Could it be that there's something that you need as a caregiver? It's interesting, when we live our daily lives and all of a sudden we become caregivers and we start to care for someone, our needs actually go up, right? And yet what actually happens, folks, is that we minimize our needs. Here's our daily life before a diagnosis of a loved one and, our needs. And as a caregiver, our needs actually go up because of the tax and tension and stress of being a caregiver. We actually minimize them and put them even lower than we had them before the diagnosis of an illness. Just be mindful of that. And then it goes from here to here. So this gap of lack is so impactful on a caregiver. They go from needing more to having less. It's almost like a double whammy. I ask caregivers to identify their values with respect to caregiving. And what I mean by that is that what's important to them? What is important to them, not just in relation to the person they're caring for, but what's important to them in their life. And in there, sometimes those needs that aren't met, those values that can't be upheld, there's a loss. And in the experience of the loss, there's grief. And once we engage the grief, then sometimes we can process the feelings of guilt when we can't have that which we want, where we can't fulfill the values that which we are instilled with. Recognize for the most part, you did or continue to do the best you can with what you have, making the best choices at the time. I try to give myself and everybody else, especially as caregivers, the benefit of the doubt, folks, is that you're doing the best you can with what you have in the situation that you've been given and with the skills and tools that you are afforded. And in that way, it takes out the bias, the conditionality, the judgment. And then if we can maintain that perspective, sometimes that's the good reference point with which to recognize the almost the inadequacy of the guilt, right? It's just a recognition and awareness. If I am here, but I feel like I'm here, then there's a difference. And that difference, sometimes it shakes the stickiness of the guilt. It makes you question it. Should I be feeling guilty? Why am I feeling guilty? Am I really guilty about anything? Some more, folks. I mentioned this earlier. Consider readjusting your guilt into regrets, right? If you can change it into, I wish I had done that, but I didn't at the time. I did the best I can at the time. But I regret not doing more. A regret is a little less heavy and invasive and sticky than guilt. Guilt involves self-reproach and self-critique. A regret says, well, I'll try to do better next time, if there is a next time. Become aware that caregiving is one of the most demanding, difficult experiences we can have as a human being, folks. It is mentally, emotionally, regardless of what stage of cancer your loved one is at, it is still mentally, emotionally taxing because we are looking at change, we're looking at loss, and we're looking at possible death and the inevitability of complete change. That's hard. That's very hard, right? And I hope in that self-awareness and that perspective, we don't lose the fact that there's not much to feel guilty about in the care that we provide. Please accept your needs. If you can identify them, recognize them. You don't necessarily have to fulfill all of them, but accept that you have needs. I don't ask caregivers to fulfill all their needs. Some will never be met. I know some individuals I'm caring for in their 20s, caring for a parent who's dying. They have lost 3-4 years of their life, right? And the needs that they wanted or the values that they had at that time will never come back. But to accept the fact that we have needs is very important because that serves to somewhat dissipate the experience of guilt when those feelings of needs come up. Recognize what you may be projecting as the ideal caregiver. We mentioned this earlier, is that where do you set your ideal as a caregiver? Where does that come from and why? Where do you learn to be a caregiver or to see what a caregiver is and then find yourself inadequate or lacking with respect to what you perceive as the ideal? That perception alone can take away or dissipate at least or shake the foundation of any feelings of guilt that we don't measure up or we don't do enough. Understand you'll be a more effective caregiver when you take care of yourself, especially emotionally. The irony of it is that if we are able to find that which will support ourselves, care for ourselves, even minutely, right? I mean, as I mentioned, right? Usually we go from here, instead of, you know, providing more self-care, we actually drop it and sacrifice ourselves. We can even just bring ourselves back to baseline. That will actually make you a better caregiver, right? And which offsets the feelings of inadequacy, helplessness, hopelessness, and guilt. Find an avenue to express and normalize your experience of guilt, folks. The best places are usually caregiver support groups, such as Wellspring or here at Kensington Gardens, Kensington Health Center, is that you see other people who are caregiving struggle with feelings of guilt. And it's so comforting, I find, to watch a group of 10 people all talk about feeling guilty in almost the same way, that they feel guilty about almost the same things. And in hearing it from somebody else almost normalizes, says, I'm not the only one that feels this. I'm not in isolation. I'm not, unique. There are many, many others, and most others that feel the same way. As I mentioned, folks, we would love to have you in a caregiver support group, Caregiver Connects. It doesn't even have to be here. Gildas Club has one, Wellspring, Kensington, your local hospice. Folks, without caregivers, there would be such a load on the healthcare sector that they would crumble in a day. I was going to talk a little bit more about COVID, but I see we're getting close to time. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. I'd be happy to field any questions regarding COVID and caregiving. I'll tell you what's happening for the most part, folks, is that caregivers are home. It's been kind of like a double-edged sword in the sense that they are able to be home more for those who can't go to work or have to self-isolate. But at the same time, they're constantly faced with a less shortage of outside support as a caregiver, such as a loss of PSW support, or very simply, being in constant presence of a loved one you're caring for, which gives you absolutely no break because we can't even go outside, which is very, very challenging. Or we can't leave and have people come and stay. I know our volunteer pool, hospice volunteers, haven't been able to go and visit clients. I can't even go and visit clients in their homes, which is it's very, very challenging. All the support is over the phone, but we find ways: Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, phone. We find a way. We find a way because we must support our caregivers, especially those who are informal caregivers. Folks, I will also just like to show you this. This is called a kintsugi bowl. It's an ancient Japanese healing practice, and I put it up there. That's a bowl that I made actually. In times of when the bowl is broken into pieces and many different pieces, as caregivers, we try to hold all the pieces together, and sometimes bring the pieces back together to create, some semblance of a newer life or a change in life or a different life. And this can happen in the process of caregiving because nothing's the same after a diagnosis. Actually, nothing's the same from day to day, let alone after a diagnosis. And in Japanese culture, the perception is that you take your broken pieces and you put them back together the best you can. And you hold no judgment on how they come back together, whether they're crooked or they're perfect or pieces are missing, because pieces will be missing in our lives after we caregive for somebody. And then we paint the lines in gold. And the idea behind that is that we don't necessarily have to feel shame and guilt and hide our cracks in our lives, especially as they have been changed by a cancer diagnosis. We actually highlight them to show our resiliency, to show our vulnerability, to share our vulnerability, to share our struggles, to share our feelings of fear, apprehension, anxiety, hopelessness, and guilt. And that's what we do in a lot of the peer support groups. And thank the Japanese for for providing the lesson. I'll show you this, and this is what I feel we really are, folks. We're a bunch of broken bowls, really, who have been put back together over and over and over again that signify our lives. You can see the one right at the bottom even has a hole in it, because sometimes in the role of caregiving, nothing's ever the same, and yet we carry on. The bowl is in some way still functional, if we so wish to carry our bowls in our lives changed forever. Thank you very much. I think I left about 15 minutes to answer any questions, provide any support, or yeah, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Rami. That was amazing going through all of that. And just one question we have, will there be another caregiver talk scheduled?
Yes, definitely. We're hoping to have, we have about 10 topics, and we will definitely continue the topics for sure. Absolutely. Whatever we can do to support caregivers. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So if anyone does have any other questions or like to engage, feel free to send us a message or click the raise hand icon, and we'd be more than happy to have everyone interact.
I just hope everybody's safe out there. You know, these are unprecedented times. I really hope you're safe and taking good care.
Mm-hmm. And Claudia, looks like we have one more. Oh, Claudia, are you able to hear us?
Yes. Rami, thank you. Thank you very much, because this presentation really clarified all the other concepts that we were exploring in the last two sessions. And now it makes way more understandable and having a clear view of the difference between the feelings and the emotions and how we go in spirals sometimes, and the importance of recognizing all those underlying emotions that can bring us to guilt, and really how much guilt is that one. So thank you for this.
Amazing. Thank you for the feedback, Claudia. And that's really what it is. It's different avenues with which to experience or investigate or even process the challenges of being a caregiver.
Mm-hmm. All right, so looks like we're just getting some feedback. So thank you, Rami, for sharing. It's a great session. People seem to find it very helpful. Looks like Anne has another question as well. Hi, Anne, can you hear us? Hello? I think I just...
Now there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I unmuted myself.
Perfect.
Thank you. Rami, I think you hit on a lot of the points that I hadn't even really analyzed myself. You know, I hadn't even looked, oh yeah, that's right. I do feel that way. I shouldn't feel bad about feeling that way. And one relief that I have, one way that I get relief is, I guess, through sort of sick humor. But I have a few very good friends that I can go and say outrageous things to when I'm feeling very upset and frustrated, and not feel terribly guilty. Maybe I do at the time, but I find that helpful for myself as well.
Oh, wonderful to hear. And I think, you know, it's very fortunate to have people in our midst, if you do, that you can just say the most outlandish things, because all they are is sometimes just dissipations and vents, and sometimes that's all we need. Oh, yeah. You know, you might not need a group or one-on-one support, just somebody just to go, man, you know, I wish this would happen. I'm just done with this, right? And that could be just enough. It's somehow even an acknowledgement that, and it's subtle, sometimes unconscious acknowledgement that you're at your end, right? And you just need a break. That's all I need sometimes. It's just an acknowledgement on some level. Thank you, Anna. I really appreciate the feedback.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. So glad you could join us. And we do hope you found this session to be very supportive and informative during this time. And I hope everyone takes care of themselves and stays safe during this time. And with that, I wish everyone enjoy the rest of their day. All right.
Thank you very much, Benita.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Take care, folks. Be safe.
Thank you.